Okay, good morning, everybody, and I'll just make sure this mic's working. Great. So thank you very much to IREPAS for the invitation to speak to you today. And as we've heard already, I'm not coming with necessarily good news, but I suspect there'll be different impacts on different members of this audience. So let's work through the slides and see where we get to. Now, just to give some context of who I am, so my name's Lewis Redshaw. I run Redshaw Advisors, and our company's described here, but the top left there, 20 years in carbon markets, and that's me, right? So I spent 20 years looking at trading in helping customers with carbon markets, and I spent the first 10 years at Barclays Capital, and then we've set up on our own Redshaw Advisors. And to tell you what we do, at the heart of what we do is informing, advising, and then helping companies with procurement within environmental markets. And so we do lots of work with lots of different industry types across Europe. And now, of course, CBAM has come to town and is making the EU ETS go global. So for those of you that have been able to avoid thinking about the EU emissions trading scheme, the EU ETS, I'll give a real quick recap what that is. So EU industry has got to buy carbon allowances. For each ton of CO2 that a cement plant, a steel plant, an electricity generator puts into the atmosphere, that company needs to come up with what's called an EU allowance, representing 1 ton of CO2. So you have to match emissions with carbon credits that you either get given for free or you have to buy them. In the case of the electricity sector, they have to buy every single ton. In the case of other energy-intensive industry, typically there's a free, what we call a free allocation. Each year that's measured, and the carbon allowances that match the emissions are retired in a registry. About 4,000 companies, slightly more, are covered by the EU ETS, and they represent about 40% of EU emissions. There is a thing called ETS2, which is due to start in 2027, that will expand the ETS. It's a bit more complicated, so I won't go into the detail of that. What that price on carbon has done is caused EU industry to decarbonize. Now, it can decarbonize in 2 ways. It can make itself more efficient, or it can close and rely on imports. And so a ton of CO2 today costs about 70 euros. And I'll show you a graph of where the price has been and where it's projected to go. Now, at 70 euros per ton of CO2, you can start to imagine that companies in Europe are going to seek to decarbonize. They're going to find clever ways to reduce their carbon emissions. Now, what's really important to make clear is that unlike any other commodity market in the world, the supply is fixed. And the supply is fixed on a path to zero by 2040. So you imagine the oil industry had a supply cap of 0 in 2040, everyone would be scrambling around to try and find alternative ways of fueling their vehicles. In the case of the EU ETS, supply goes to 0 in 2040, and you can expect that prices are likely to increase because the cost of reducing carbon to 100% in the case of the EU is more than 70 euros. So what's driving CBAM? That should hopefully be obvious by now, carbon leakage. And when we define carbon leakage, it's a situation where, due to costs of environmental policies, businesses transfer their production outside of the EU and rely on imports. So now, carbon emissions in the rest of the world pretty much have got away without being priced. So if we take the steel industry as an example, a steel producer in Turkey will not be paying for its carbon emissions and will have effectively a free rider benefit of exporting its steel, supposedly at a lower cost, certainly at a lower cost when it comes to carbon, exporting that steel to the EU. So that's given, despite what we've just heard from the OECD, that has helped profitability of exports to the EU. Now, how to fix that? Well, the EU has come up with the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and the objective of the CBAM is to make competition fair. We can argue about the rights and wrongs of that statement, but that's the outcome they're aiming for, is if you want to reduce emissions in Europe, it's got to be the case that other companies that want to export to Europe need to pay a similar cost. Otherwise, EU industry dies. Now, what that means is imported goods will have their embedded emissions measured, and companies will have to buy what are called CBAM certificates in order to comply with the new rules. Now, CBAM certificates are a little bit like EU allowances in that companies in Europe have to buy EU allowances every year, and companies importing to Europe need to buy CBAM certificates. One EU allowance is 1 tonne of CO2, one CBAM certificate is 1 tonne of CO2. Now, the implications for industry should be pretty obvious, and the sectors that are covered by the EU CBAM, and by the way, I keep mentioning EU CBAM because since the EU came up with this idea to level the playing field, the UK has announced plans to implement a CBAM, and that is expected in 2027, but is out for consultation at the moment. The US has plans for some form of carbon border adjustment mechanism. So interesting times ahead from a carbon perspective. Now, the way that the CBAM works in the EU is that companies must have registered already in 2023. They must be measuring, reporting, verifying their emissions. And in 2026, that's the so-called definitive period, that's when companies have to start buying CBAM certificates in order to comply with the rules. And what the EU is doing is they're phasing CBAM in. They're not just throwing it on the global manufacturing industry. They're phasing it in 2.5% in 2026, growing to 100% in 2034. So there's a little bit of an on-ramp, shall we say, to allow industry to adjust. Now, if I consider, so apologies, all the stuff came up at once on this graph, but let's look at the blue line to start with. Now, in Europe, the way that Europe used to deal with international competitiveness issues was to give carbon credits to industry for free, the so-called free allowances. And so in 2025, subject to a benchmark, companies could receive up to 100% of their allowances that they might need for nothing, right? And as you can see, what the EU wants and needs to do is to, now my laser doesn't work so well, they need to reduce that free allocation over a period of time, in this case to 2034. And that means European industry will have to start buying much more of its carbon emissions allowances. And the CBAM phase-in mirrors this reduction in free allocation. So we talk about leveling the playing field. Well, companies that are importing into Europe will start having to pay CBAM, and companies in Europe will start getting less free allocation. So everyone's on the same page when it comes to carbon costs. That's the idea. So you can see here in our graph that the free part for EU industry goes down, and the import duties for importers go up. Now, I mentioned that the supply goes to zero in 2040. Well, if we have a look at where prices are, prices are around 70 euros at the moment. I've already given the game away with my y-axis here, where prices may well be headed. So this is the price of EU allowances, and you can see for years and years and years, the carbon price hung around in single figures, and that was because the system wasn't ambitious, and the EU recognized that and started to change things. We see a spike here in 2022, the average price was something less than 100 euros, but we got to a price of 102 euros in 2022, just so we're really clear that these are average prices. The price is really volatile intra-year. And what's really amazing about this chart here is that we go north of 250 euros per tonne of CO2. Now, if we ever get to that point, we suspect things will be a bit different. We suspect that quite probably a price that high will put a lot of companies out of business anyway, and so we'll see if that moderates. But right now, with the ambition the EU has set, that's where analysts expect the market to go. 2040, when we hit zero, is not even on this graph, and I didn't want to show it because it's, we're looking at 400 plus euros according to the analysts, and that's obviously unsustainable. So we don't like to get too excited about the longer term. But if you think about how you decarbonize an entire economy, it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be more than 70 euros. So just to emphasize, the beginning of CBAM, 98 euros, the middle of CBAM, 150, and when we hit 100% phase-in, 250 euros, roughly. So a quick look at how this works in practice. So Turkey exports a load of different things to the EU. You can see, actually, their cement sector is slightly more efficient than the average EU. The aluminium sector is by far less efficient, and then the other two are sort of somewhere in between. And what that means is that in 2030, I think we've got 100,000 tons of goods here for the different sectors. You can start to see the kind of cost impact that's going to have on those sectors. And by 2034, when we've got 100% phase-in, assuming the price forecasts are correct, those numbers really jump, right? So we're talking some serious money to comply with the EU CBAM. And I've got a case study. It's cold rolled steel. I appreciate this is a long products conference in the main. It's the analysis we did most recently, and interestingly, it's the bit that China exports the most at the moment. So we looked at cold rolled steel, and we made some assumptions. We've got to bear in mind that every import is different. So we get embedded emissions vary by plant, by company, and by country. So typically, China and India are the least efficient, but there will be plants within China that are probably more efficient than the average in the EU. It depends which one's exporting to the EU. And indeed, companies, if they own several plants, can pick and choose which plant they then send the steel from. So there's a load of optimization in there for larger companies. The EU gets its imported products from a bunch of different places. The carbon price, so we'll go into the equation in a moment, but the carbon price that a company pays already is deducted from the CBAM costs, and that varies by different countries. Typically, it's zero. So we've assumed these things. So we've got embedded emissions for cold rolled steel, 1.9 tons of CO2 per ton of product. In the EU, 1.3 tons per ton of product. And just for the example, we've got 400,000 tons of imports. And that companies are not paying for their carbon. And this is how it breaks down in terms of the calculation. So we start off with the embedded emissions. So that is your direct emissions and your indirect emissions through electricity. We consider the benchmark that the EU has set for that sector. We apply the phase out. We talked about that percentage on the graph earlier. We add in the EU allowance price at the time of import, and then we subtract the carbon price paid domestically. And what that gets us is a cost per ton of imported product. Now, with the example we've got, with the assumptions we've made, this cold rolled steel is 1.9 tons of CO2 per ton of product. In the EU, it's 1.3 tons. The phase-in rate in 2030, for this example, 51.5%. Price forecast of 150 euros. No domestic carbon price paid. That results in an additional cost, a tax of 185 euros per tonne of product. So that's pretty chunky. And when we add all that up together, for that 400,000 tonnes of imports over the course of the next 10 years, we're talking €750 million of tax. Right, so this is serious. And what you'll notice is the 2026 number, it's a phasing rate of only 2.5%, but the number, right, the effective tax paid per year is much more than 2.5%. And that's because there's a normalization that happens first. It's what's the emissions per tonne of product, what's the EU's emissions per tonne of product. The difference between the two has to be accounted for first, and then 2.5% of the EU's product value is then applied all the way through to 100% in 2034. So what's less appreciated, I think, in the CBAM world is that the upfront cost is much greater than the 2.5% that I think most people have assumed to date. So what can you do about that? I'm just going to check the time because I know that we started a little late. So the CBAM certificates that importers need to buy, well, the cost of those is based on the average price of EU allowances that week, the week that they're bought. And the problem with CBAM certificates is you can't really use them to hedge your exposure today, for example. You can't buy them, right, which is pretty unhelpful. You can't buy them until 2026. You can't trade them. So if you bought them, you can only use them yourself. You can't sell them to anybody else. They only last for 2 years. So if you buy too many by mistake, then you may be left with a loss if you forget that you've got them and they're 2 years old. You can sell them back, but there's a limit to how many you can sell back. And they're subject to a minimum, to avoid credit risk, there's a minimum holding threshold. So if you're importing goods, you need to have 80% of these CBAM certificates in your account at any one point in time. What that does mean, because CBAM certificates are linked to EU allowance prices, is you can use EU allowances to hedge if you wanted to. If you want to get ahead of the curve and get involved in risk managing your CBAM exposure into the future. EU allowances are a tradable instrument in a very liquid market with a low bid-offer spread. EU allowances trade all day, every day from 8 o'clock in the morning, European time, until 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the afternoon, in the evening. EU allowances are digital certificates. They are held in an electronic registry. They've got no cost of storage. They've got no vintage. They last effectively forever within the EU ETS at least. They can be traded by anybody, anywhere in the world. And of course, the CBAM certificate price is derived from EU allowance prices. So if you were to buy EU allowances today, I've assumed 70 euros in my presentation. The market's actually been a bit weaker than that. This morning it's popped under 64 euros. If you were to buy EU allowances today, then that gives you some optionality. Right? With those EU allowances, you can sell with an appropriate partner in all likelihood. You can sell and purchase CBAM certificates as and when you need them. If the carbon price got so high and the CBAM certificate price got so high, but the product price didn't increase enough, you could just not export product to Europe and sell the carbon credits. You could sell the carbon credits and decarbonize and reduce your CBAM exposure, and so on. So you can see that having some sort of hedge in place gives you more flexibility. And to work an example of this, we've got the numbers I put up on the screen earlier, €750 million. And if you were to buy spot carbon credits today, 70 euros, it would cost you that much, right? Because the price forecast obviously makes that difference, which we've got here. Potential saving, if you are a believer that carbon prices are going up and you're also conscious that you probably can't decarbonize yourself at 70 euros, then this is a likely way to go. There are opportunities today that can allow companies to take advantage of that softer EU allowance price. Now, whether you decide to do any hedging is very company specific. Are your imports less carbon intensive than the EU benchmark? If they're less carbon intensive, then you're all good. In the case of, I think, US steel, there's good chances that, they're right there. You've got to take the view that you believe in the forecasts. Frankly, if we're considering talking to companies about hedging their CBAM exposure, it's the same discussion we would have with any installation in the EU ETS. Do you believe the price is going to be higher? What's going to happen in your market if the carbon price is included in your product cost? Does the product price go up? Most likely it does, but it might not. Does demand go down because the product price goes up? And so on. Understanding how your competitors are operating in the market is obviously important. What your marginal abatement cost curve is. If you can decarbonize for lower than the carbon price, then that's what you should do, right? And avoid paying the CBAM altogether. And of course, hedging depends on credit if you're hedging forward, or cash availability if you're hedging in spot markets. And you may feel that buying a bit helps you with the exposure, or at least the perhaps the more volatile parts of the carbon market, or buying a whole lot. I mean, we know companies that have bought 10 years worth of carbon, admittedly when it was much lower than it is now, but they bought and hedged for 10 years of carbon exposure. Others buy 1, 2, 3 years into the future. This is what we do. I won't dwell on this slide. I would like to turn it over to questions, if anyone has any. We've got one right at the front. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. There will be a lot of questions, I believe. So let's start with Mr. Baysal.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. I noticed that you guys created another business, and in this business, there's a lot of questions, but one of which is, who decides what's your CBAM rate? I mean, there must be an institution or institutions in different countries to go and inspect and decide on the rate. So, and how do you monitor them? Because you really, I mean, these companies that really supposedly monitor and give you the rate has to be monitored because there's a lot of dollars connected to it. Now, also when you mention everything in the playing field with Europe and all that, and there's a lot of blast furnaces in Europe. Do they pay anything, or is just the carbon border? So that means the mills in EU, yeah, that blast furnaces, for example, are the higher pollutants, and do they pay anything, or are they free because they're raising the rates on them? Mm-hmm. And also, who makes the market? I mean, who decides, and where does the money go to?
All great questions. So I'm going to have to try and remember these and answer them at the same time. So the first one is who checks the numbers. So in the EU's case, so in the UK's case, the UK says, well, look, here's the number, and if you think you come lower than the number, then prove it. In the EU's case, everybody has to prove it. And so you have to work with an approved verifier. Now, the approved verification system has served the EU emissions trading scheme since 2004. The emissions trading scheme started in 2005, but they were verifying emissions in 2004. And they've got a tried and trusted mechanism by which verifiers are approved and cross-checked, double-checked to make sure their numbers are accurate. So who checks? It's so companies like Den Norsk Veritas and other verification companies, quality control type companies, and they make an assessment, and they sign for liability for that assessment, and so it's got to be a major company. It can't just be anybody that does that verification. So that's who checks and makes sure. And each company has the ability to have their product, their process verified, and their emissions intensity measured and provided to the EU as part of the CBAM registration process. At the moment, the EU uses default values because that whole process is pretty complicated. But the expectation is we move to calculated values, verified, certified values. That's the first one. The second one, mills in the EU, do they pay? Right now, okay, so the way that the free allocation that I talked about works is that the top 10% most efficient plant in the EU, they set the benchmark. And if you are at that level of efficiency or better, right, you're getting 100%, actually possibly more than 100% free allocation. But it's the top 10%. So the other 90% are below that level. And the people that are below that level, they've got to pay the difference between their efficiency and the benchmark efficiency. So they don't get the same free allocation. They get less than what they need. So it's not done on a grandfathering basis. It's done on a benchmarked basis. So 90% of installations in the EU are already buying some carbon. I can't tell you how much right now, but there'll be some pretty inefficient plants down there at the bottom and some that are just right close up to it. They're getting somewhere between 100 and well, I don't know what the range is, but something less than 100% is what they're getting. So some steel companies have to buy carbon credits. In fact, most steel companies have to buy carbon credits in the EU. But the hidden cost that gives an advantage to steel producers overseas is actually the cost of electricity. So electricity costs in Europe are the highest in the world, as far as I'm aware. And part of the reason that they're the highest in the world is because electricity producers don't get any free allocation. They have to buy all of their carbon. So of course they pass all of the carbon cost through in their electricity prices, which the steel industry has to pay. Now in some countries, it gets a bit complicated. In some countries you can get an extra subsidy from your government because you've got high electricity prices. But you have to prove that there's a higher cost, and most countries don't actually provide that subsidy. It's an option that the EU gave different countries. You can imagine Germany is pretty hot on that, so Germany gives that subsidy away to help out with higher carbon costs due to electricity prices. So that's industry. And your last question was, where does the money go? Right, so this is, the money goes to the European Commission. Right? So when you're buying CBAM certificates, the European Commission are issuing these certificates, and that's where the money goes. Now, obviously that's a bit controversial, but it's expected that the CBAM will get through the WTO rules, and countries have the EU has been quite clever about how they put this thing together. They're trying to encourage decarbonisation globally. Arguably, there are parts of CBAM that would cause a carbon-intensive steel actually to displace EU's less carbon-intensive steel, but I won't go there right now. They've been quite clever. They're trying to encourage decarbonisation, and they're saying, look, if you pay carbon price at home domestically, as long as it matches or exceeds what we're going to charge you, you don't have to pay us anything. Right? So the EU, on the one hand, looks like they're trying to take your money. On the other hand, they're actually trying to incentivize governments to charge for carbon domestically. So if you take Turkey as an example, big exporter to the EU, they are planning to start their own domestic emissions trading scheme next year. Right? If you've got a domestic emissions trading scheme and the companies that are exporting to Europe have to pay for their carbon, instead of paying the EU, they're paying their government. What the government does with that money then is kind of interesting. They might be able to find a way to give it back to the companies, but they're trying to cause countries to have a price on carbon in order to incentivize less carbon-intensive behavior.
So basically you're saying that even 10% will top. Basically what you're saying is in EU, the standard will be the top 10% of the EU mills that produce, and that will be the standard and everybody else pays.
Yes.
You're going to put a lot of blast furnaces out of business soon.
There's a lot of discussion around exactly how that benchmark value will ultimately be settled on. It hasn't been decided yet, but yes, that's the expectation.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Well, there are many questions. Let's start with the gentleman over there. Go ahead.
Hi, Zach Newman, M7 Metals. Do you have any sense of how this will interact with quotas into Europe?
Right, that's a good question. No. I mean, my understanding of quotas is that it is a quota at a high level, so it's not per country. Have I got that right? No, okay. So I'll probably best not answer that question, or try to answer that question, because I don't understand the quota system. It certainly will affect. So if you're, I was looking at some. I should have put the graph on my presentation, but I left it a bit late. If you take the EU's average efficiency for flat and long product, right? The US comes in underneath in both cases, whereas China and India are far and away. They're a long way away from the EU's average. So China and India are going to have the very highest costs of CBAM, and the US will have the lowest cost of CBAM. So depending on how the quota system works, you can start to understand. You just look at the relative carbon intensity of different countries and make some guesses, I suppose, on that basis.
The quota system is actually going to come to an end by 2026. So probably CBAM will replace it as a
possibly
protectionist measure. Yeah. So there's a question, please.
Thanks for presentation. And a question is about European market. So what we see now is that like in the big companies who are producing flat products, for instance, currently they do not stop in the blast furnace. Meanwhile, we have oversupply on the market, obviously, yeah. And one of the reasons which what I'm hearing is that they need to keep some volume of production in this year to receive free allowances in the next year. Could you comment here? So how is it calculated, and does it make sense, this reason?
Yeah, we're getting into the detail of the EU ETS, and I'm very happy to answer those questions. So the EU ETS historically was a grandfathered system. So whatever you polluted in the past, well, that's the starting point, and we'll give you a free allocation that looks a bit like that. They moved to the benchmarking system such that the less efficient installations are more incentivized under the free allocation system to improve their efficiency. Because if you're not getting as much as you want, then you're going to try and find a way to get as much as you want, which is to make yourself more efficient. And that wasn't really working. And don't forget, the free allocation system is there to help those companies on an international market. If you penalise industry in the EU completely and don't give them a free allocation, EU industry will go out of business completely. So the free allocation model has been used in order to protect EU industry. But at the same time, the EU is trying to incentivize EU industry to decarbonize, right? So you can't decarbonize if imports are carbon cost free. So what they did is they came up with another twist. This is before CBAM, which has said, well, if you reduce your emissions by more than 15%, then you will get a cut in your free allocation. When I say not emissions, actually, if you reduce your productivity by more than 15%, you get a cut in your free allocation. So I think ThyssenKrupp announced relatively recently a drop of 20% of their production, right? And that would cause them to lose free allocation. And you can't get it back again until you've proven your production's gone back up. So there is a method by which companies can't shut down or semi-shut down and then just bathe in a pool of extra EU allowances that they don't need for production, that they can use to subsidize their production. Now, they get their free allocation cut. And what CBAM does is it just takes away free allocation, right? So none of these other methods of calculating things are actually relevant anymore. Come 2034, everybody's paying for their carbon, whether you're an importer or whether you're a domestic producer.
Thank you. Another question here, Rami.
So thanks, Luis, for the presentation. I have a couple of questions, actually, quick one. First one, since you are working on the case closely, I mean, in the past many years, do you have an expectation or let's say preliminary information on when the EU will decide the verification bodies or the certification bodies for this CBAM. We are reporting now in this, last intermediate phase till 2026, but whenever we are asking them, we have no answer when they are going to release the verification certification body and who will be those bodies like. This is the first question. The second one, do you think that they are, the EU, they are having really, let's say, a firm intention to keep the carbon tax in the countries where those countries are abide to the same EU system, so that, for example, I'm coming from Egypt. So they think that if tomorrow the government of Egypt will be following what the EU they are following, then they will keep the carbon tax for Egypt? Thank you.
Sure. So on the decisions on the certification bodies, I don't have the answer either. Although my colleague, who spends pretty much his entire working life on CBAM issues, is going to have a better idea than me. So very happy to take your details and put you in touch and see what we can do. And then so if Egypt had a carbon tax, so the current price of EU allowances is 64 euros. So if you want to buy a CBAM certificate today, it'll cost you 64 euros if you could buy a CBAM certificate today. So the calculation envisages the subtraction of a domestic carbon price. So if the carbon tax in Egypt was 70 euros equivalent, then an Egyptian producer would have no liability to CBAM. And the exact way that the EU calculates that liability is up for grabs, I believe, also, because if you're buying these CBAM certificates once a week, on what basis are you measuring the carbon tax level? So if it's a fixed tax for a year, that's easy. If the price is going up and down because you've got a carbon market in Turkey, for example, then is it the average price for the year? Is it the price at year end? What is it? Right, we don't know, but I suspect it'll be the average price. And you can subtract that cost, and you subtract that cost from your CBAM liability that you have to the EU. Hopefully that answers your questions. Great.
Thank you very much. I guess that was the last question. So, sorry, I didn't see. I'm sorry.
Hello. It's not a question. It's a comment about what you're seeking. What are you speaking? So, in my opinion, CBAM, it's made by Europe not for emission issue. Actually, it's made not to anti-dumping. The Europe with steel came from Turkey or from China. So even if we solve this problem, next year they will add another 50 euro or 100 euro, not to keep this CBAM issue going on. So this is my opinion. I want to share it with you, and I want your comment about that.
Oh, I can't tell you what the EU's underlying motive might be for the CBAM. What I can tell you from my own observation, and indeed this question came up with one of our customers last week. They said this is unfair, right? And then when we sort of worked through the analysis, well, they said, it's unfair, we're just going to sell our business and we're going to close it down. And I said, well, okay, well, actually, right, if the cost of carbon is now going to be equally applied to both domestic and importers, then the cost of the product, or rather the price of the product, what people will pay for the product, must go up, right? And if the price of the product's going up, then you're going to get compensated for your cost of carbon. And if you're compensated for your cost of carbon, who cares, right? So, of course, that's a big if you get compensated for your cost of carbon. And also, you might get outcompeted by someone who's more carbon efficient, who was sending their steel to Asia, is now sending it to Europe because from that plant, they can get away without the CBAM. So there's going to be some distortions, and it's going to be unfair in some ways. And of course, we can never assess the impact of a higher price on demand for steel. So we've talked about low demand from OECD's presentation. Well, demand may cut also. So it's not good news, That's for sure. All right? Unless you operate one of those really efficient plants. But beyond that, you know, I think it's as fair as the EU can make it, because they've got to get it past the WTO. Right? I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. So, thank you very much, Luis.
Thank you very much.